Chapter 7. Steve is arrested. Friday, June 12th, 6:50 p.m. The heat hung heavy over Bob Lawson's farm. Temperatures all week had been sizzling, but Bob could smell a change in the air. Cooler air was on the way. By cooler air meant thunderstorms. That could mean crop damage. Bob Lawson was a 22-year-old farmer. He lived directly across the road from the Air Force Base on a 150-acre mixed farm, where he still lives today. He raised a few chickens and some pigs and harvested firewood and hardwood from the woods in the back 50 acres of his land. He had 40 head of cattle. Lawson's farm was a kid magnet, and Farmer Lawson welcomed them. In an innocent time filled mostly with innocent, decent people, Bob Lawson was the cream of the crop. Friday, after supper, Steve headed for Bob's farm. He felt troubled after his interview with Inspector Graham that morning. At the farm, Steve rode with Lawson on the tractor to the nearby field. With rain threatening, Bob wanted to harvest as much as possible before the promised storm. The talkative Lawson and Steve were both quiet that evening. The events of the week had been stunning. Steve found comfort in the isolation of the farm and the company of his young farmer. While Lawson harvested the field, Steve rested on a nearby rock. Later, when Lawson looked up, Steve was gone. At 6:50 p.m., Steve was walking down the farm lane. A black and white police car drove up. Many rural residents referred to a police cruiser as a Holstein, after the black and white breed of dairy cattle common in the area. Others referred to it as a skunk car. Same colors, different image. Acting under orders from Inspector Graham, Constable Donald Tremblay pulled his cruiser across the entrance of the Lawson laneway, blocking Steve's path. Constable Tremblay leaned across and opened the passenger door of the cruiser. "Hop in, Truscott," he said. "We need you to verify your statement from this morning." Steve found the officer's tone frightening, but he got in the car. Nobody told him he had rights, that he could have refused to get in alone. Without explaining where they were headed, Constable Tremblay drove the 20 kilometers to Goderich, to the OPP detachment. There, Inspector Harold Graham awaited their arrival. Julian Scher, in his book, Until You Are Dead, quotes Inspector Graham boasting of this move years later to a group of police inspectors. The inspector knew that legal guidelines required a parent or social worker to be present during the interview of a child, but, as Graham said, "I chose to disregard those guidelines." Steve was handed a sheet of paper. His answers from the morning session had been typed up as though he had written the account. He was asked to read the statement out loud. He did. "Any changes?" Graham asked. Steve said he had not returned to the school by 8 p.m., but a bit before 8 p.m. The change was made. Steve signed the statement. For another hour, Inspector Graham and Constable Tremblay took turns grilling him. "What happened, Steve?" they asked. "Tell us the truth." As always, as he has for more than 50 years, Steve did just that. But the questioning went beyond details of what happened that evening. The questions became direct and accusatory. "Have you ever taken a girl into Lawson's bush?" "No." "Have you ever made a date to take a girl into Lawson's bush?" "No." "Have you ever spoken to Jocelyn Godet about going into Lawson's bush?" "No." "Were you at Jocelyn Godet's house on Tuesday night?" "No, I haven't been there since winter." "Did you ever phone Jocelyn Godet?" "No." Inspector Graham would question Steve. He would leave the room. Constable Tremblay would enter. More questions. The same questions. Steve repeated his story. Over and over. This was no good cop, bad cop show. It was more like bad cop, bad cop. The police wanted a confession. All Steve had to do, they said, was to tell the truth. After 90 minutes or so, surely aware by now that his parents were searching for him, the OPP officers drove Steve back to the guardhouse at the base in Clinton. Shortly after, Steve's father arrived, visibly upset. Surely, Steve thought, this would now end. But the interrogation continued. The guardhouse was the home of the service police, the seat of authority in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Daniel Truscott, Steve's father, was an enlisted man, trained to obey. The air base was run by officers. The guardhouse was run by officers. The police involved were seen as authorities and were regarded as officers. But officers were also to be trusted. Soon, thought both father and son, the officers would realize he was telling the truth, and Steve could go home. At some point in the evening, Dr. David Brooks arrived. As the base doctor, Dr. Brooks had been at the Truscott house after school that day. He had tested Stephen's color vision. Perhaps someone doubted he could have seen a yellow license plate from the bridge to the highway. Now the question of a medical examination was suggested. Stephen's father was reluctant, but at the urging of others agreed. Nobody asked Steve. Dr. Joseph Addison, the Truscott family doctor, was called in from Clinton. Working together, Dr. Addison and Dr. Brooks examined Steve. They asked him to strip. They noted a number of scratches on his arms and legs. They were described as scratches normal for an active outdoor boy like Steve. The doctors also noted 2 open, oozing sores, one on each side of Steve's penis. Each was the size of a quarter. Dr. Addison asked, "How did you get such a sore penis?" Steve replied, "I don't know. It's been that way for about 4 or 5 weeks." Steve added that it wasn't sore. "Were you masturbating?" asked Dr. Addison. "No." "Were you out with some girl you were trying to protect?" asked the doctor. "No." "Did you get it cut in a knothole?" "No." Finally, at about 1:30 a.m., Steve sat alone, pecking away aimlessly at a typewriter. He couldn't type. He had no message. But he admired the smooth action of the typewriter keys. 2 doctors, plus Inspector Graham and Constable Tremblay, waited in the next room. Inspector Graham thought Steve was typing out a confession. They waited. Finally, Dr. Addison said, "I'll go back in and see if I can get a story from that boy." He entered the room and sat with Steve. While Steve talked, he took notes. Steve repeated the story he'd been telling for 4 days. By now, it was 2 a.m. Steve was exhausted. Steve's father was sent home. Should he have called a lawyer? Likely. But Dan Truscott still trusted officers, including police, to be fair. Surely no fair person could believe Steve was guilty. At about 2:30 a.m., police took Steve to Goderich to spend the night in jail. The next morning, Steve's father turned on the radio. The lead news item was the arrest of a 14-year-old boy for the murder of Lynn Harper. He sat in shock, unwilling to believe it. Chapter 8. Injustice Begins. July 14th, 1959. Looking back, the arrest of Stephen Truscott was a travesty, but it was nothing compared to the legal dance that continued for years. Steve's family had hired Frank Donnelly, a well-known local lawyer. Donnelly seemed to be a good choice, but he had little experience with murder trials. In those days, there weren't many lawyers with experience in that area, especially in a little town like Goderich. Steve's first defeat in the system came 2 weeks after his arrest. At the age of 14, he was a juvenile. The law said so. But at a special hearing, a local magistrate, a lower court judge, made a key ruling. Steve would be tried as an adult. According to law, this could be done only when the good of the child and the interest of the community demand it. It is hard to see how this was for the good of Stephen. The distinction was important. The sentence for an adult convicted of murder was death by hanging. But during his month in the old Goderich jail, built in 1842, Donnelly kept reassuring him. "Don't worry," Donnelly said. "You'll never go to trial. They don't have any real evidence." Looking back, that was true. At least the part about the evidence. The first legal step in the process was the preliminary hearing. At this hearing, a judge decides if the police and Crown have enough evidence for a trial. Like most people those days, the Truscotts trusted the legal system to get things right. Donnelly undoubtedly felt the same. And Donnelly was more than a dull small-town lawyer. 3 days after the trial ended, he was appointed a judge. The hearing began exactly 1 month after Stephen's arrest. Donnelly was right. The evidence was all circumstantial. Nobody had seen Stephen harm anyone. No one had seen him take Lynn Harper into the woods. Not a single clue linked Stephen to the crime scene. Fact: Lynn Harper had been murdered and sexually assaulted. Her body had been found in Lawson's Woods. No one disputed that fact. Fact: Stephen Truscott gave her a ride on his bike. They left the school somewhere between 7:15 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. Fact: Stephen had 2 sores on his penis. Police interviewed a variety of people, adults and children, who had been at the school, at the bridge, or on the road between them on that fateful evening. The stories that emerged from those interviews were often confusing. In some cases, witnesses even contradicted each other. However, 2 of Stephen's 7th grade classmates had constructed stories that implicated Stephen in the crime. Jocelyn Godet claimed Stephen had invited her to look for calves in the woods that evening. Butch George said Stephen had told the police he had seen Butch at the swimming hole that night. He suggested that Stephen had asked him to say he had seen him there too. Neither Butch nor Jocelyn was known for telling the truth. Both tended to change their story with each telling. From their interviews, the Crown had gathered a number of people who had or hadn't seen Stephen and Lynn together on the road that night. In charge of the preliminary hearing was Magistrate H.E. Holmes. He was not in good health at the time. A few months later, he died of liver failure. Even though the Crown's case was based on flimsy evidence, the magistrate didn't hesitate. At the end of the 2 days, he rapped his gavel on the bench and said, "Well, in my opinion, the evidence is sufficient to put the accused on trial." Stephen's lifetime walk through the swamp of Canada's legal system had begun.